Good evening and welcome back to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. I'm welcoming you to our virtual Dominion Energy Jazz Cafe series. I promised you 6 episodes during the first journey through our walk down the memory lane of jazz and the history of Black art and Black music. But we have a fantastic opportunity to afford you a bonus episode featuring, my heart tickles, one of Richmond's living musical legends throughout jazz, throughout R&B, throughout wind and brass instruments, and just throughout the history and life of artists in this city and in this state. And that is Mr. James Branch, affectionately known as Plunky. Welcome to the series, sir. Welcome to the museum. Welcome to the line of programming that I've been trying to offer from this institution. I am without measure feeling the amount of joy and honor to have you sitting across from me in this space. Would you introduce yourself to my audience who likely knows you very well and tell us a little bit more about who James Branch is and about your music?
I am James Plunky Branch, and I've grown up in Richmond, been performing here for about 50 years. But my journey, while it begins in Richmond, transverses New York City, where I went to college at Columbia University, San Francisco, and the Bay Area of California, where I was introduced to African music by a man named Ndiko Aba, who is a Zulu from South Africa who was in exile. This is before most of you were born. This is in the year of 1969-70. After spending some time in San Francisco, I moved back to New York, where I was involved with the jazz scene there and a record label called Strata East Records, where I got involved with a number of legendary jazz musicians, including Ornette Coleman and Pharoah Sanders and Rahsaan Roland Kirk and Sam Rivers, and I could go on. New York being the rich jazz environment that it is. Eventually, I moved back to Richmond in 1974. I brought my group Juju back to Richmond. We had been an avant-garde jazz, African jazz group. When I got back to Richmond, though we put a lot of effort into it, Richmond was not very open to avant-garde African music at that time. And over time, my music evolved to include more of R&B and funk music with that African jazz. And that created a kind of a unique niche for me and my band. We influenced the creation of a kind of music called go-go out of Washington, D.C. I had the opportunity over the years to travel to Africa 6 times, toured in Europe with a man named Bobby Bird, who was associated with James Brown, took my band on tours of Europe, went to Ghana, West Africa, went to Cuba, went to Brazil, all during which time I lived, resided, and brought what I found in all those places back to Richmond. And so Richmond has influenced me in my music, and I hope that I've influenced Richmond and the Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic with what I've been able to bring back from those places that I've journeyed through.
I would say that you certainly have. Even before our meeting, I knew who you were very well, Mr. Branch, friend of people that I hold dear in my family, of some great influences of mine. And so in that way, I was introduced to who you are and what you've been doing from a young age. And I'm sort of meeting an icon, a low-key hero of mine right now in the course of this interview. I'm interested to learn about your perspective of rhythm and of chord progression and of the use of sound that you've encountered throughout your travels. I'm asking because previously in this series, we talked to Jeremy Winston and to Victor Brooks and to Valerie Cassell-Oliver, and in those conversations, we talked about the importance of things like improvisation, things like learning through the oral tradition, discussing how blacks in this country were not allowed to read or learn, and so how did we educate ourselves? And it was through the oral tradition. I'm also thinking about rhythms and sounds leaving Africa on that boat ride, like Victor likes to say, and coming across to this continent, living with the enslaved African people, and then traveling around our nation later on, decades and centuries later, through events like the Great Migration or the advent of radio. Excuse me. And so I'm wondering, if you've noticed influences from Africa or from other places of the world in music in which you did not expect?
Absolutely. I would say I have a philosophy that incorporates Africa and Africanisms in music. A thumbnail history which you've summarized. Africans came to these shores, we say in 1619, but long before that they had been traveling to these shores. Africa, we speak of it as if it's one place, but there are many different cultures, hundreds if not thousands of different tribes and subsets to that culture. But there are some through lines. And one of the through lines of African culture is that music plays an integral part in everything that's done in the tribal community, from teaching the young to preparing to go to battle to preparing the fields. Everything is done to music. And even though we have a rich, diverse culture on that continent, there are some things that are common almost throughout. Rhythm is very germane and important to African music. Polyrhythms. Poly is a prefix that means many. So sometimes we're having many rhythms being played at once. The intersection of those many rhythms creates another subset or reverberation of rhythm. And so this idea of rhythm is very important to African music. Secondly, I say music is functional in African culture, so that typically Africans don't judge music based on what chords or even the correctness of the rhythms. They are judging the music based on the effect the music has on the culture, on the society, on the tribe, on the gathering right now. Third is what you bring up, improvisation. Improvisation is the art of making something new right now, responding to circumstances, responding to influences, and making something new and meaningful and useful this minute out of this instant. So add those things to the concept of energy. I know energy is a very generic term, but I'm using it in the context of what we might call soul, the idea of expressing oneself energetically. The idea in African drumming, in African ceremonies in many different societies, the idea is that you invest the energy, that you overexert yourself and extend that over a length of time until you reach a state that you've never been to before. The idea that the spirits will come to you through these rhythms, through the expression of these rhythms and chants, but your use of energy in such a way that you go beyond your what you might have perceived as your capability. I'm going to express that like if you're a runner. You might run 10 miles a day, but you get to this place that some people call a runner's high. You get to a second level of energy. That's what African musicians are striving for, that we're performing at such a high level of energy that we break through what might have been a barrier or a limitation and reach a higher state. And in that higher state, it is believed that the spirits come to you and express something from other realms. All of that was true before Africans came here. But when they came here, one of the things that happened was they were forbidden to use their drums. They were forbidden to speak in their native languages. There were some obvious reasons for this. The slave masters were fearful that the Africans would collude, would conspire. So they forbid them to speak in languages that the slave masters, couldn't understand. They wouldn't let them play the drums because in their terms, the slave master said, those drums make them wild and uncontrollable. The Africans would say, the drums let us communicate with our spirits, our gods, our ancestors, and they give us this extra strength, this extra energy. But something happened in the course of the enslavement, in the course of working the fields, in the course of doing the work. It was discovered a couple of things, that when the Africans were allowed to sing or express their rhythms while they worked, two things. The slave masters could know where they were because they were making that noise over in the North 40. And they noticed that they got more work. The Africans worked more efficiently when they were allowed to play this music or sing this music. And so the Africans were able to keep some of their musical culture alive, even though they couldn't speak their native languages, even though they were working beside sometimes people from different tribes or different parts of West Africa. They were able to communicate rhythmically. They were able to groove. They were able to learn something about themselves or remember something about their lost culture. And they were able to create new music. They almost had to create new music because they couldn't speak their native languages. They made up sounds, they made up rhythms that allowed them to work, express themselves. And on Saturday nights or some Sundays, they were able to play music that expressed what they were learning in this new society. That music became the first American music, because the Europeans had brought some music, but they brought the music and played the music that was there. Right. This was American music because it was new. It was created from scratch. It was improvised out of the cultural situation that they were in. So this is American music, the beginning of American music, this black music, these work songs, and eventually, as I've heard you talk about, the spirituals, the music that was expressed on Sundays, because while for the most part, Africans were not allowed to study, learn to read. They were not allowed to be educated. But they were taught Bible stories. There was this idea among some of the slave masters that the Africans could be redeemed, their souls could be saved if they were taught Christianity and the Bible stories. So the Africans would make up songs about those stories. Typically songs about the Israelites being held in bondage. Stories about figures in the Bible like Moses who rescued his people. These stories inspired the Africans, and so they would make up songs like "Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land, tell old Pharaoh to let my people go." They could relate to that story directly. Those spirituals became later gospel music. There were groups instrumental in this, most notably the Fifth Jubilee Singers, who took the music as newly released slaves in the 1860s, 1869, 71 through 71. Newly released slaves were singing those slave songs in a more formal way. And so those songs became gospel music. I'm giving you a thumbnail history probably more than you wanted, but
that's exactly what I wanted.
In the later 1800s, newly freed slaves were now, in some instances, free to travel and try to earn a living. One of the ways that they earned a living was to play music. Remember I told you at the beginning, Africans came from a culture that music was important to everything that was done. Africans made instruments with what they found, even in slave times. They might make string instruments. They might create banjo-like instruments, violin-type instruments. Eventually, Africans were given guitars or other instruments, and they were free to travel. And they traveled from place to place. And these itinerant musicians would make up songs, improvise songs. And this form of song, this solo musician song form, the blues, came out of the South. And it eventually, I'm going to skip some things, but eventually they traveled up the Mississippi and went from places like New Orleans and rural places to places like Memphis, to St. Louis, eventually to Chicago. And if we skip ahead in that history, those blues songs that went to those urban areas, 40, 50, 60 years later, would create a music called rhythm and blues. The rhythms of the cities added to those rural blues song forms became rhythm and blues. Simultaneous to that 50, 75 years, the music of New Orleans is a central place to the creation of jazz music, because New Orleans not only sits at the mouth of the Mississippi River, it also is a place that had people from the Caribbean, people from South America, people from the rest of the United States, and the people from Europe coming together in a major port. And those people coming together had an amalgamation of music.
Right.
And that amalgamation of music grew to what we would call jazz music. And jazz music, beginning from around the turn of the century, 20th century, but most notably by 1920 we had what was called the Jazz Age. And then I can speed up and say in the 20s we had kind of Dixieland, New Orleans jazz being the influence. By the 30s we had big bands playing a very mellow kind of swing dance music, pop music. By the 40s we had bebop music. By the 50s bebop turned into hard bop, blending with R&B, and we get this rich music that we call black music today.
It's a beautiful tapestry of love and of creativity. This theme of improvisation is very dear to me. I talked in our last episode about my journey through music, and I talked about grappling with understanding what ornamentation is in the Baroque era. I use ornamentation very well, as many singers and instrumentalists do, but I like to think about the similarities between what an ornament is and what improvisation is. And in my opinion, in my experience, the use of improvisation is so much bigger than the use of ornamentation. While I find ornamentation beautiful and a lot of fun to engage with, to be completely free of expectation and of rule and of tradition and allowed to just express what's happening in that moment as you describe is powerful to me, is spiritual to me, in a way that reminds me of the story you just told about the drums. That's very powerful. In your experience as a musician, how do you find that you use all of the tools that you've learned through the journey you've just expressed, through the lessons we learned from ancestors, through the lessons you've learned from great legends you've engaged with? How do you take all of those things and create music?
Well, first of all, I like to think of improvisation as instantaneous composition. Not just responding to the moment, but as you say, combining this moment with the history, with the lessons, with the instruction, with the training, so that it's not just free form. It may sound like just free form, but the skilled improviser is combining this moment and the audience that is presupposed with the training and the history. Another thing I would say about improvisation is that all improvisation isn't the same. You can have everything from free form, without thought, the interaction of sounds, not even necessarily in musical terms, totally free, and that would be a kind of improvisation. You could also have the most disciplined structure with the allowance of just nuance and change of timbre and change of tonality without changing the notes of a song, and that would be improvisation as well. A skilled jazz performer, gospel performer, might make only very subtle changes from one rendition to the next. But every time that they would perform a song would be different. Sometimes slightly different, sometimes greatly different. Improvisation is about taking chances.
I like this. I like this very much because it's reminding me of my own use of improvisation. And often when I'm singing, I notice I'm using my hands or my shoulder or my neck or my head or my voice itself in ways that I'm not trying to do or thinking about, but in the exact same way my mother did when I was a boy watching her sing and learning how to be on stage myself. My improvisation is my own, but it's also my way of alluding to the influences of my past,
Absolutely.
to the loves of my artistic creation. Well, Plunky, this has been a fantastic conversation. I want to talk a little bit more to you, but before then, I would love to hear you play one of these beautiful instruments, to experience some of this improvisation that we've been talking about. Would you mind giving us a tune?
Not at all.
All right, fantastic.
I'd love to.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Oh my, thank you. Plunky, Mr. James Branch, thank you so much for joining us this evening. That was an inspiration. It was moving. It was unexpected. It was inspiring. I mean, I'm going to live off of this for the rest of the day, if you don't mind.